Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tom Fuller. I am the Director for Professional Development here at NAGC, and in my day job, I'm the Communications Manager for the Oregon Department of Transportation. Really excited to moderate today's session with Dr. Clay Dyer. And I think Clay gets the award for the most creative session title, The Neuroscience of Once Upon a Time. And we were chatting before the session this afternoon, and Clay was really saying, the brain is the brain and it works the way it works, and the brain loves stories. So I'm excited to hear the content today. Clay, about 10 years ago, left a successful academic career to ghostwrite, to do research, and to do lots of consulting. And he has this unique combination of the academic's obsession with detail and also the love of the storyteller's pace, rhythm, and a compelling hook. So today, the neuroscience of Once Upon a Time. Be sure to ask your questions in the Q&A, and we will be asking questions of Clay as the presentation goes along. So Clay, take it away.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you everybody for being here as part of this session, and for the organizers for organizing something in difficult times, to be sure. It's been a great lead in and set up. So just a little bit about myself and moving forward here. Let me just get things moving. Just a little bit about who I am and my background and how I came to this obsession with storytelling and this fascination with storytelling. As Tom said, I'm not a neuroscientist. I was an English professor for 20 years across Canada and in parts of Europe. I left the academic world about 10 years ago to work with clients on key soft skills, really, around leadership, around internal and external communications, around organizational culture, around problem solving and decision making. The research I was doing at the time suggested there was really a gap in soft skills in this industry, in various sectors across this country. And I thought I could fill it and move away from the academic life that I'd known for a long, long time. But I'll take you back even a bit further by way of setting up the history of that story. To the very first day I was teaching. And this is a picture actually of the very first classroom I ever taught in. And the story goes this way, and I'll pull back the curtain a little bit on your favorite university professors from your careers to let you know that we're not taught how to teach. English university professors, for the most part, aren't teachers, they're researchers, or writers, or scientists, but we're tossed into teaching. And I was literally tossed into teaching. I'd gone across the country, arrived at the campus where I was doing my graduate studies about 3 days before the first day of the new term. Walked in, had met my supervisor, had met people in the department, came back on a Monday morning to start my week. And my supervisor, who happened to be the chair of the English department, grabbed me and said, "What are you doing in an hour?" And I said, "Nothing." And he said, "Well, you look old." I was 29, had gray hair. He said, "You look old. We just had one of our profs had a heart attack. You're in the room." And that was literally, I hadn't read the book. I didn't know the class. I actually didn't even know where the classroom was on campus because I hadn't located anything yet. And literally that was my first moment of engagement with teaching at a post-secondary institution. I came in this door here into a room of about, at that point in time, there was about 125 not really, less than welcoming audience members, shall I say. There were business students, there were science students, they were not art students. I was tossed in to the ultimate non-receptive audience, people who had to be there to fulfill an English credit. So completely a rookie, wearing sneakers, jeans, a t-shirt. I think I might have grabbed a sports jacket at some point during the day. Tossed in, no notes, no syllabus, no knowledge whatsoever. And in that moment, I realized I had two choices. I could try to fake it till I make it. It's a phrase that I really don't like and think is incredibly dangerous. Or I could just try to engage for that hour. And I literally said, I told them what I just told you. I just drove across the country. I don't know what I'm doing. I know nothing about what's about to happen. So let's figure this out together. And I just spent the next hour telling them stories about who I was, where I'd come from, how I'd gotten there. It went okay. It went relatively well. The term unfolded as it should. And I realized in that moment that I was onto something, that storytelling, that me just relaxing into who I was as a natural storyteller was going to be useful to me at some point in this career. So I focused on honing my storytelling. I paid attention to what worked. I paid attention to what didn't work. I did some research into strategies around how to build stories, why some of the storytelling strategies I was using would work, why they wouldn't work, and why why I could watch people become more engaged when I was telling stories, not just dumping data, not just lecturing like many of my colleagues would do. It was people were reacting differently. The comments about the course were different. The engagement levels were different. My course grew in popularity. So pretty soon, this was the smallest room I was working. I was soon working, lecture halls of 300 people. And it all continued to flow. So I wanted to really start to understand why this was working. And it gradually became one of the key strategies, or the strategies that really defined who I was as an instructor, as a speaker, and later in my career as a public speaker and representative of ideas for the university across media and across various outlets. And it became very important, I learned, for teaching, sharing not only content, but for some of the applied skills I was trying to get to people, critical thinking, logic, problem solving. So I would always start my courses, got in a habit of starting my courses this way. I'm going to tell you a lot of stories during this term. Some of them are going to be 100% true. Some of them are going to be partial truths. And some of them are going to be 100% fiction. But you need to know two things as we enter into this journey together for the next X number of weeks, however many it was, wherever I was teaching. Every story has a reason for being part of this course and will bring you value at some point, right? There will be value in the story and there's a reason for it to be here. It's not just filling space. And the second thing is, if you ever want to call BS on one of the stories, please feel free to do so. And I promise you, I will always answer honestly whether the story is 100% fiction, part true, part fiction, or 100% true. I will confirm for you that you're critical thinking, that you're questioning. I'll validate that by responding to my story. Epic successes, absolutely, and some epic failures, which is important, as we'll return to later on in the hour. And this is the really important part for me. Over the years since I quit teaching, and over the decades since I quit teaching, whenever a student reaches out to me, and it happens sometimes 10 times a year, sometimes once a month, sometimes more, sometimes less. Whenever a student reaches out to me, they're always reaching out about one of the stories I told. They were rarely, if ever, reaching out about the content, right? Could have been the best lecture in the world, but they really reach out and continue to reach out around the story. And because I was teaching for so long, sometimes it's now, I was telling my son or my daughter this story, or I saw this event and it reminded me of this story that you told. But it was always about the story. I hear people reaching out all the time about the story. And I'll give you an example. In 2011, back further, I gave a lecture. It was about the theme of death in literature or film or something. And one of the students said to me, "What are you afraid of? You're older now. When you're 19, mid-30s is old. You're older. You must be afraid of death. What are you afraid of?" And I said, "You know what, guys? I'm not really afraid of much, except viruses." I said, "Viruses terrify me." And I went on to tell them the story about how I've been reading about viruses and how viruses mutate and they transfer so easily. And I said, they're these crazy, wonderful, wicked, cool creatures. And they do all this, but they can destroy us so easily. And they're so small and we can't see them. They terrify me. Viruses terrify me. 2011, the film Contagion comes out. My email starts to light up. You told us the story about viruses and this guy made a movie about viruses. They must have been in your class. They must have heard one of your talks. And I went, no, trust me, I'm not original on this one. It's been around for a while. I just turned it into a story for you guys that day. A year ago, 18 months ago, when COVID hit, same thing. People were reaching out saying, "Remember the story you told us about viruses?" It was the stories they remember. The content was in there, it was embedded in there, but they really remembered the stories and retained the stories. Okay, so what this got me to understand, and this was a motto that I've used when I work with clients now, and I try to explain to them the power of storytelling, why we want to continue to hone our skills, practice our skills, trust storytelling. There's a science behind it and there's a cultural value behind it, and we'll talk about those. But really for me, it was this motto, was that we can share information logically. We can share information, in a structured, formal ways, through spreadsheets, through PowerPoints, through Prezis, whatever format you use. And that will get you from A to B. You can get from A to B doing it logically. And for those of you that went through university and have those incredibly dull lectures, they were getting from A to B. But it's the imagination part. It was the storytelling part that will get you everywhere else. It will get you to the point where 10 years after the fact, students still remember the "what are you afraid of about death" story, or stories that I told about my kids, or stories that I told about travel, or stories that I told about, right? So if you want to get only from A to B, it's a very easy thing to do. You just present your information, present your data. If you want to get all the extra benefits, all the extra value, which we always do in our businesses or our jobs or working with our clients, we want to get them that extra bit to differentiate them from the rest of the people just doing the data dumps and the spreadsheets. That's where the storytelling comes in. That's where it takes you everywhere else. I always say to the people I'm working with, my clients, my students, even when I was doing it with them, was storytelling is like the ultimate Trojan horse, right? Built by Odysseus to get into the city of Troy. But it's not done in that classic sense. It's not a malware. It's not devious. It's not trickery. So when I say it's a Trojan horse, I'm always telling people it's more like Mary Poppins' spoonful of sugar. Or, the Roman poet Horace once said that in order to educate people, to edify people, you also have to entertain them. He was very clear that you need to find that fine balance between education or edification and entertainment. That's where storytelling becomes that ideal, beautiful Trojan horse. It gets information across to people for very specific reasons. I'll touch on it in a few minutes, but it gets information across to people in a way that educates and engages and stimulates them in ways that other forms of communication do not. And Guy Kawasaki wrote a wonderful book called Enchantment, which talks about the art of changing hearts, minds, and actions. And this is what storytelling does. Storytelling is enchanting. It's the process of delighting people with an idea, product, or service. The outcome is voluntary, and this is really what's crucial, is when you tell a good story, when you convey ideas to people through a great story, they take that information in voluntarily. So that you're not forcing it upon them. They actually see it as a process that they're driving, they're part of. And the long-lasting support is mutually beneficial. So not only is it voluntary, but their engagement is beneficial. Kawasaki says it this way: it's not about manipulating people. It transforms situations and relationships. It converts hostility into civility and civility into affinity. It changes skeptics and cynics into believers and the undecided into the loyal, which is all we're really trying to do when we're communicating. We're trying to get people to be loyal to our ideas, to buy into our ideas. Okay? Think of it this way. Storytelling takes communication from a transactional exercise to a relational exercise. It really reinforces relationships. Okay? How does it do that? Now we're getting into the science part. Well, studies will tell us again and again and again that by becoming a good storyteller, by honing your storytelling skills as a communicator, you increase your stock in terms of social currency, emotional currency, and the practical value that you can bring your organization or your client or the idea or service that you're trying to get people to buy into. So it has these three levels of value. It does so in these ways. The perception of social intelligence is higher for people who are good storytellers. Social intelligence drives that ability to build relationships and navigate social environments. So it allows you to build relationships in various environments across constituencies, across communities, across audiences. It's especially important when building up a structure that will guide social decisions. So if you want somebody to support an event or a law or a legislation or a candidate, storytelling is perceived to be in a strong relationship with social intelligence. It's also linked through studies very clearly with novel and adaptive thinking. It's seen as allowing people to think outside the box. So another one of my least favorite terms, but if you're a good storyteller, people perceive you as being an adaptive thinker, a creative problem solver. Okay, again, study after study after study, there's a strong correlation between good storytelling and the perception that you are a creative thinker or a good problem solver. It is incredibly useful at supporting cross-cultural competency. In workplaces and organizations, in communities where we have more and more cultures living together all the time, there is one common denominator. Every culture, regardless of where they come from in the world, tells stories, right? The once upon a time framework works for every culture. It's the one thing we have in common as people around the world, right? Other than our basic biological functionings, every culture tells stories. So people are almost pre-wired, hardwired to be receptive to storytelling. I worked for a number of years in a program that was truly, it was kind of a groundbreaking program in that I was the co-chair of a program with a Malaysian-born, Texas-educated civil engineer. I'm a Canadian-born English professor trained in Ontario. So, you know, and we were physically very different, tall and dark skinned, short and white skinned. So we were talking different languages. We were talking engineering language, we were talking arts language. The one thing we found we had in common very quickly, and that all our students in the program soon learned, is they're both pretty good storytellers. His background was very much oral tradition, storytelling. My predilection was always oral tradition storytelling. So we got together, and the language barrier was not a language barrier. I mean, in terms of we were talking different things often, but we had that storytelling in common. So storytelling can really overcome cross-cultural barriers and even generational barriers. So you add those together. It is, again, very strongly correlated to benefits in what we call transdisciplinarity. In other words, engineers are great at talking to engineers, but how do engineers talk to finance people? Or how do finance people talk to the general public? Stories start to bridge the gap between all of those disciplines, right? So if you hone your story, if you work with finance people, I work with finance people, I work with politicians. If you teach them that, you know, get out of finance speak and just tell a story about how this is going to impact, you know, Susie down the block, you will engage the audience. The audience is going to kind of zone out and turn off the minute you start talking finance speak, show your nice spreadsheet. They're wonderful for information, but they're not engaging, they're not captivating, they're not enchanting. So storytelling with this kind of cross-cultural and enchanting energy to it really starts to get over those typical silos and barriers. And working organizationally, I often just say to people, just tell me a story about what we need to know. How this is going to impact the community. How is this going to impact? That's what we want to message out. We want to message the story out. If people want the technical details, they will reach in and get the technical details. If you want key technical details built into the story, we can do that. But the driver is going to be the story, not the technical details, all the time. And finally, it really helps with cognitive load management. Okay, you'll see in a minute, I'm going to the brain science in a minute here, but we know, and we all live it, is that there's so much information bombarding us all the time, whether it's cell phones or 24-hour news cycles or hundreds of channels that we can get, podcasts that we can get. We are being bombarded with information way more than previous generations have been bombarded with information. Our brains haven't really changed much from previous generations. Yes, we know they're adapting. Right? Attention span is quite factually starting to shrink because of our brains are slowly evolving to modify to adapt to all this kind of information that's coming in. But the brain is slow to adapt. I mean, really, our brains are very similar to the brains of our grandfathers and our grandmothers. So what has changed is just the amount of input. Our ability to process that input hasn't really evolved that dramatically. So we get overwhelmed, right? We all know the feeling. It came to a point where I had to detox from 24/7 newscasts during certain election cycles or during certain issues, only because I just get overwhelmed. And you start to go into shutdown mode. You literally start to not be able to process, or anxiety levels go up. So we know the minute you start to tell a story, you can watch people's brains slow down, you can watch their stress levels go down, and you can watch them kind of open up to processing the information. Because people, you're kind of hardwired, right? From every culture, across time, across geography, we're hardwired for stories. So our brains like them. Our brains get very relaxed with them. Our brains are open to them. Our brains are receptive to them. And that's really critical to why it's so important to take this as part of our toolkit and moving forward. And here's why, here's how, here's the neuroscience part. We know that storytelling, literally that once upon a time framework that you've heard about in other sessions that people have shown you how to do, that they've given you examples of, they literally generate higher cortex or more evolved cortex activity, okay? If you are just sharing data with somebody, just information, data, here's the stuff, A to B, two parts of the brain really light up, right? You've seen the experiments, they put a hat on people, they feed them inputs or stimulus, and parts of the brain fire, and they can measure the firing of the brain. If you're just giving somebody data, information, two parts of the brain fire up, Broca's area and Wernicke's area. One is like the input, in other words, language comes in, and it's like, the microphone that brings the language into the brain. And then the other one processes that data. So you have the input mechanism and the basic processor get engaged when I'm just giving you facts, all the facts, that's it, okay? If you start to reframe that data in terms of storytelling, a lot more of the brain starts to fire, okay? You still have the input, you still have the processor, but you also get the motor cortex, you also get the sensory cortex, right? And you also get the frontal cortex. And the reason these are important, as you'll see later, is the minute you get the sensory cortex involved, the brain starts to do other things. The minute you get the frontal cortex involved, this is the big hitter, you get, it controls things like attention and concentration, working memory. So people remember things that activate the frontal cortex more than they do if you're just hitting one of these, the Wernicke area, for instance. So anything that gets the frontal cortex engaged goes into the memory more actively. It controls and influences reasoning and judgment. It controls and influences problem solving, and it controls and influences decision making, right? And if you're a communicator, and if you're trying to get your message to more and more people, have more and more people understand, have an affinity for your ideas, these are the parts of the brain that you want to get firing. Because this is where they start to remember. This is where they start to judge and reason. And if you have a logical structure within your story, right? It's embedded in your stories, this wonderful logical structure, people will understand, people will remember, people will process more effectively. We know that. The little cap with the little wires shows us that. The more you turn, the more data you focus on, you're shrinking the engagement of the cortex. The more you story tell, more the cortex gets into play. Critical stuff. Okay. Add to that, that when the brain experiences an emotionally charged event, like a story, and emotionally can be sad, terrifying, funny, anything that gets people engaged at an emotional level. And remember, when you start to storytell, sensory and motor start to activate more, so they're engaging. The brain releases the neurotransmitter dopamine. Okay, it's the stuff that cocaine triggers. It's exactly the same neurotransmitter as something like cocaine triggers, or when you exercise a lot, you get that kind of runner's high, or when you play something like Uptown Funk by Bruno Mars and you can't stop but moving, or you want to get up and dance. That's that's dopamine. That's the pleasure drug, right? And what we know about dopamine is, okay, now you have the frontal cortex engaged. Dopamine is linked to remembering. So you remember easier and more accurately when you have elevated dopamine levels. You are in a better mood when you have elevated dopamine levels, which means you're more motivated and engaged in what you're doing in the moment, which is very often, listening to a speech, listening to a meeting, getting information. So if you can elevate your audience's dopamine level and engage their frontal cortex at the same time, you are putting them in an optimal position to hear, to understand, to challenge intellectually, to raise engaged questions. Again, science reinforces it. Storytelling is linked to both of these. So even as a teacher, I would often say, one of the rewards I gave students was I would always play music when they were coming in the room. And it would be something that I would try to find out what would engage them, what would make them dance in the aisle, what would make them start swaying their seat, what would make them kind of come alive as they were coming into the lecture hall. I would have it booming out of the speakers on the side of these lecture halls. There was a method to the madness, right? The method was, I want to elevate their dopamine. As they come in, I want to elevate their dopamine so that when I hit them with let me tell you a story at the part to start the lecture, they were in that perfectly primed position to kind of input that information I was about to share with them and remember it as easily and accurately as possible. And I'll give you a hint. If you ever want to do it, and the song that seemed to work the best, and people was Vanilla Ice, Ice Ice Baby. Worked every time. You could not have that song booming and not have people starting to literally seat dance. They were smiling, and you could tell they were just like, they were ready. They were ready to go when that song was done. Storytelling is also activates what we call neural coupling, so that as the frontal cortex is starting to fire, different parts of the brain are starting to fire. The person is the receiver, the listener, the audience is starting to generate new ideas in and around the ideas that you're sharing, right? So, and in particular, the more neural coupling you can trigger, it correlates stronger with deeper understanding, because you create what we call anticipatory responses, so that people are going ahead of you in the story, trying to think, oh, what's going to happen next? So they're trying to anticipate where you're going with the story. And either you reinforce that anticipation or you veer off with a bit of a surprise twist. That generates a deeper understanding. Either they're satisfied with the fact that they got ahead of you and figured it out, or you twist it a little bit and surprise them. Boom, either pathway will generate a deeper understanding of the information that you shared in that story. And the final one, the way the brain works, the final piece is what we call neural mirroring, or just mirroring. Okay, and this it's fascinating, a little bit scary, and just interesting to the extreme. If I am telling you a story, my brain is working in a certain pattern. The rhythm of the story that I am telling you is creating a certain pattern in my brain, a certain pattern of activity, certain coupling, certain neurotransmitters are being released, certain parts of the brain are firing at certain points of time. There's a pattern occurring in my brain as I tell you the story. As we go deeper into the story, your brain, as the audience, starts to mirror my brain as a storyteller. So the listener's brain starts to mirror the activity of the teller's brain. It's kind of like brain melding, right? Is that because I am setting a certain rhythm with my story, what's going on in my brain starts to go on in your brain and everybody else's brain in the audience. Okay, that's why if you ever go to like a comedy show, at the beginning of the set, the audience is a bit reserved, right? That's the comic, the comedian, starting to reprogram people, getting programmed the pattern, the brain rhythms and the brain patterns set, right? You come in, you're all excited, you want to see the comic, and pretty soon that comic starts to talk. His banter or her banter, the rhythms start to reprogram your brain to fall into rhythm with them. Okay, I was at Billy Connolly, the famous Scottish comic, was in town before COVID. My wife is not a huge fan. I'm a huge fan. I saw him when I was teaching in Scotland a couple times. Great storyteller, fascinating storyteller. Comes out, no props, just tells a story. She was kind of going, okay, I'll come with you because I love you. It's not really my thing. We get there. He comes out, he literally, let me tell you some stories. And he starts to tell stories and they wander and they meander. And he finishes his set, he finishes his act. And she looks at me and goes, that was like, why'd you buy the tickets? I was like, I would feel ripped off. That was 15 minutes. I looked at it, I said, honey, that was like 90 minutes. The show was about just under an hour and a half long. And what had happened is his storytelling, which is very rhythmic and very paced, his storytelling had literally made her brain, lose track of time, where she thought we'd been there 15 minutes. And in fact, he had not stopped talking for almost 90 minutes. That's how mirroring works, is he had literally got the audience into the same rhythm, same pace as him. So by the end of the set, we were all there. We were all in that zone with him. So as a communicator, think about what we talked about. You increase the brain activity, which increases engagement. You elevate the dopamine, which really opens all the portals, all the pathways in. You get people anticipating and really engaging with your stories and your information in fascinating ways. And at some level, you get their brain mirroring your brain. So again, everything is open and super receptive to the information that you provide. So let's think about some of the keys that we know can start to unlock some of those neuroscientific pathways. Okay, and some of this I'm sure you've heard in other sessions, but I'll just reinforce it and validate it. Is the first thing is you always want to know, why am I telling the story I'm about to tell? Remember, I said to you, I always said to my students, there will be a reason for this story and it will have value. The value might not be immediately evident, but at some point in the next week, you will go click and you'll realize how the story connected to the lecture. It will always happen, right? If I do a really good job, you will make the connection at some point. Bad stories, you don't get the connection, my problem, fix it, start the connection again. But you always have to say, what is the outcome I want to accomplish, and who am I telling it to, right? And so again, basics of communication, who's your audience, what's your message? Similar with stories, you just can't wander off. The beauty of Billy Connolly is his stories would lead to other stories, would lead to other stories, and pretty soon you're just weaving in and out of these maze of stories. That was the whole point, right, of getting you into the maze. A punchline would drop here, a punchline would drop here, and the stories would just continue, but they all interconnected in really intricate, carefully planned ways. So why are you telling the story and who are you telling it to? Okay. Each story then has an appropriate set of tools. You can use things depending on what your outcome wants to be. You can use tools depending on the outcomes you want and the audience you're talking to. Allusions and metaphors, images, offers, challenges, parables are all storytelling tools. And the key is to put them in place for the audience that you're about to tell the story to. I'll give you an example. My wife is a teacher at junior high school, and she's trying to teach them illusion. right? When you reference a film or reference a song, not directly, so you don't say, oh, that was just a, when I said Trojan horse, it was referencing Odysseus. If you don't know the story of Odysseus, it doesn't matter, you still kind of get Trojan horse. But if you know the story of Odysseus, you kind of understand more about the illusion. Cool. So the problem, I said to her, is that illusion is super hard to teach. If you look at this sign, the employee shortage is so bad that long-haired, freaky people can now apply. People of my age immediately get the illusion, right? That is to a song by Five Man Electrical Band called Signs. The first line of the song is, and the sign said, long-haired, freaky people need not apply. That's the first, the minute I saw it, I got it. I said, go to your junior high students and show them this sign, and I'll guarantee you no one gets it. And no one got it because they don't, people my age right away, people that age, no. So this is why you have to match outcome with audience, because this story would work great for people who get the song, doesn't work so great for people who don't know the song, right? It just seems kind of ridiculous, okay? A real quick film clip I want to show you. This is from the Adjustment Bureau with Matt Damon, and this will ring a bell for some of you who especially work in the political realm. I hope I can get this will get working. If not, we'll move on. I may have to move over to this monitor. Just bear with me. There we go.
I grew up not far away from here in Red Hook. I love you both. But we had a rule in my neighborhood. When you got in a fight, it wasn't whether or not you got knocked down. It's what you do when you get back up. And I came here to tell you tonight that I will get back up. It's bullshit. We didn't have that saying in my neighborhood. It's just one of those phrases that it had some traction with the focus group, and so we kept using it. That's not true. You know, in 1998, I did a cover story for GQ. The title was Youngest Congressman Ever. And since then, every story has tried to explain how I got here so fast. And the word that people kept using was authentic. But here's the problem. This isn't even my tie. This tie was selected for me by a group of specialists in Tenafly, New Jersey, who chose it over 56 other ties we tested. In fact, our data suggests that I have to stick to either a tie that is red or a tie that is blue. A yellow tie made it look as if I was taking my situation lightly, and I may in fact pull my pants down again at any moment. A silver tie meant that I'd forgotten my roots. My shoes, you know, shiny shoes, we associate with high-priced lawyers and bankers. If you want to get a working man's vote, you need to scuff up your shoes a little bit, but you can't scuff them up so much that you alienate the lawyers and the bankers, because you need them to pay for the specialist back in Tenafly. So what is the proper scuffing amount? You know, we actually paid a consultant $7,300. Was it $7,300, Charlie? $7,300 for a consultant to tell us that this is the perfect amount of stuffing.
There you go. Hang on, I've got to get this working again. Oh, sorry. That was an advanced storytelling technique, which I'm sure you've heard about today, called meta storytelling. The story behind the story. I think I might have to reshare my screen or not. At least figure out how to get it moving forward. Bear with me, folks. I'm working two monitors here, and neither one seems to want to work at the moment.
You can reshare it if you need to, Clay.
I think I will do that. Oh, there we go.
I grew up not far.
There we got it. Okay. Oops, sorry. There. So, you know, knowing your audience, knowing which story to tell and when, knowing what your outcome to be. In the film, not a strategy I encourage for a less than supportive audience, but it is a strategy nonetheless. The second piece is to make sure that the message is that in the story is clear and unambiguous. You have to have a clever story, to have a well-built Trojan horse is pointless if people aren't really clear on what the message is. And that's the biggest problem we run into in trying to teaching people how to use stories to trigger all these kind of wonderful neurotransmitters and cortexual activity, is if the message isn't clear, I can't save it. So you better have that clear message. So you make it integral to retelling the story. You make the trigger phrases that connect the story to the goal very clearly and effectively. Phrases like "just imagine that," or "what if," or "just think about this" are really clear triggers that tell the brain that the message is about to happen. It's like the moral of the story. The moral of the story better be perfectly clear. Famous story, probably a bit apocryphal. I read in an article a few years back, was at the Petrified Forest in the National Park. They were having problems with people taking petrified wood from the petrified forest. In other words, tourists would come in, visitors would come in, everybody would take a piece of petrified wood from the forest, which means that your forest is disappearing. We don't have a petrified forest after a while because everyone's taking the wood away. So they put out a message saying that in the past, many visitors have removed petrified wood from the park, forever changing the natural state of the petrified forest. That's how the story started, okay? Not a clear message. The outcome, the moral of the story was not clear. The result was exactly the opposite of what the storyteller wanted. More people started to take more wood because they were afraid there was not going to be enough wood left for them because other people were taking the wood. The revised version of the message was, we know we should have been, or was eventually, we know you love what you see at the petrified forest, but please do not remove the petrified wood from the park to preserve the natural state of the forest for other visitors. In other words, the message, the moral, don't take the wood, was made very clear. The mishandled story, did not clarify the message, left it too ambiguous, and people interpreted it in the wrong way. A huge risk that you run in storytelling is that people misinterpret your moral. Make sure your moral is clear, okay? And finally, another key is brevity. Half as long is twice as good when it comes to storytelling. Leave people wanting a little bit more, okay? When you're working with people, if you're designing messages, if you're designing stories for people to read, for your organization to deliver, think about it as a 5-minute pitch. Think about it as an elevator pitch, the 3 minutes you have in the elevator, the 3 slides that you have, and work in that practice of bullets rather than scripts. Make it more fluid, make it more organic, because people will tend to go, and then work with people about keeping it shorter. Brevity is the heart of wit, right? So you need to keep your story short. The brain won't function at that high, really effective, really wonderful level if the story starts to drag on and on, unless you're Billy Connolly, can keep it going for 90 minutes. We aren't them. We aren't those people yet, okay? A few other keys. Remember the magic 3, right? Information shared 3 times to a highly engaged cortex will optimize absorption, to put it really simply. If you repeat the moral of the story, the key message 3 times, you've optimized absorption. And it doesn't have to be repeated 3 times. You can say it once, you can show an image, you can have a song that relates, but that key message, that key phrase, that key idea, the key concept you're trying to get out, repeated 3 times in a story, is the optimal absorption. Why do fairy tales have 3 tests? Why do great epics have 3 tests? Because 3 is that magical number that storytellers have always understood will maximize impact of the story on the audience. So remember the number 3. Avoid the job's influence, okay? But remember the job's process. I've worked with business clients for so many years. Everybody thinks they want to be Steve Jobs when they do a presentation, tell a story. He was a master, but that's not everybody. And everybody's style is, so watching somebody try to be Steve Jobs is painful. What Jobs taught us as a storyteller was that details count. Okay, content and structure details count. It's the rhythms that increase dopamine. It's the rhythms and repetitions that enhance coupling. It's the rhythms and repetition and content that trigger mirroring. So pay attention to those details and then rehearse them like crazy, right? Those of you who have read about Jobs understand this process. Nothing was left to chance. He rehearsed like a madman, knowing when the pauses were going to hit, knowing when the rhythms were going to pick up, knowing when to repeat a phrase, or get that kind of almost biblical rhythm at times you can get going when you're telling a story. He understood that. And as I said early, hone those skills, right? Get the feedback, figure out what worked, what didn't, watch the audience. You can tell when they're engaged and when they're not engaged. You can watch their eyes. If you get close enough, you can just tell the way they're leaning and they're engaging. Pay attention to what works and what doesn't, and continue to hone your skills, okay? The rehearsal piece is a huge piece. I'll tell you a story. My stepson got married this past summer, and I'm not his father's favorite person. He's my stepson, get it? He came to live with Mom and I after his mother and I got married, so the father doesn't like me. So my stepson said, I want you both to give a speech. And I said, fine, I don't have to. I'll respect the fact he's your dad. I don't have to give a speech. He goes, no, I want you both to give a speech, but I'll give Dad the last slot of the night, right? The big slot. I said, cool. Give him the last slot. I'm good with that. I get up and I did this. I told a story and I framed it around Don Quixote, where he was Don Quixote and I was Sancho Panza. And I talked about the adventures we'd had over the years, and ended the story with a secret that he had that nobody knew except him and I. That was that when we were on a trip to LA once, we got him into the church. He was a recognized priest of Dudism, which, if you ever watched The Big Lebowski, it's the kind of philosophy that's built around the character of the dude. And we got him a T-shirt and we got him a card, and he's legitimately a recognized part of this order. That was the story I told that his bride that night didn't even know about. So I kind of gave the secret out at the end. That was the end of my story. And then I thought, well, this would be nice. Dad can get up now and tell other stories about his son, and this might ease some of the tension of the evening. It'll be cool. It'll be fine. I did a good job. I told the story. I made him happy, made him cry, made him laugh, made everybody was good. Father got up and tried to go spontaneous, extemporaneous, without presentation, without preparation, without rehearsal. And I had rehearsed mine numerous times. It was a disaster. I felt bad for him, right? I mean, my story was funny and engaging and good, and then somebody tried to follow up with an unrehearsed story, and it failed miserably. And I actually felt bad for the man that he hadn't taken the time to prepare that. It was a big deal for his kid getting married. Do a good job. Prepare, please. Rehearse, please. And finally, recognize that the people you're working with and for are going to be terrified of this process. They're going to be absolutely terrified of this process. And there are reasons they're terrified. The greatest fears they have, as you get them into the storytelling, is the performance piece, the fear of exposing too much of who they are. In other words, the authenticity piece, the vulnerability piece. They don't They aren't comfortable being creative, which is why you don't force them into Billy Connolly or Steve Jobs storytelling. You let them develop their own rhythm, their own style, their own pace, their own voice. But they're really afraid of failure. And what I always say to the people I work with is the really cool thing about telling stories is that even a failed story becomes the next story. And if you approach it that way, right? Thomas Carlyle's famous reminder was, no pressure, no diamonds, right? So if you don't put yourself out there a little bit in creating these stories as part of your communication strategy, you never have the failure, but you're never going to have that success, right? You're never going to get that cerebral cortex, that frontal cortex, just engaged fully and firing with the dopamine. So just recognize that the people you're working with are going to have these. So these are the greatest fears. There's actually a term for fear of storytelling or public speaking. These are the great fears. And if you mitigate those through the science and through the controls and through the kind of structuring that you can bring to the table as a writer and as a communicator, you're going to put them in the best position, knowing that the science is opening up the brain and the structure and the process can share the data and share the information far more effectively than they have been in the past. So there you go. I'm almost about 9 minutes ahead of where you need to be. Lots of time for questions. Please don't feel to reach out after the fact as well. You can get hold of me. If you want the science behind it, I've left all that open. Please don't hesitate to ask.
Wow, Clay. All I can say is wow. Thank you so much for sharing. We do have a couple of questions here. Interesting, I'll tell you a story. Something that hit me when you were talking was that I used to be a pastor for many years, and I don't think anybody ever remembered my 3-point sermons, but everybody remembered the stories I would tell about my evil apple tree in the backyard. So the power of story, you know, I absolutely agree with you on that. And one person wants to know, are you going to be able to post those PowerPoints?
PowerPoints have been posted.
Okay.
I don't think I posted them with notes, but if you want the notes, you can always just reach out, and I'll reach in and post the ones with notes after the fact as well.
Okay. So the question that we have is actually posed by our NAGC president is, how do you see storytelling working into healing some of the divides that we see in our country? And I don't know what the political situation is like in Canada, but you're probably obviously aware of some of the divides that were going on here in the States. And I just, this person and I wonder about that too. I mean, is there a place for storytelling in the healing?
To your first point, yes, I am aware. And yes, we have the, you know, politics has become so partisan and culture has become so divisive. We have it here too, and we see it all the time. And I mean, what we know about the science is if you get people emotionally connected to the story you're telling,
mm-hmm.
That engagement goes up. And what I always say is, in an interesting way, you're trying to hit them emotionally in order that their brain starts to function like it should, rather than them defaulting to that kind of divisive, closed, I call it closed, it's not closed-minded, it's actually closed-brained, right?
Yeah.
When you're trying to convince somebody, if you're trying to convince a conspiracy theorist that there's no conspiracy, you're not going to ever get the point across. It doesn't work, right? They've closed off. They're not listening, they're not logical, they're not reasoning. You can hit them with all the data in the world and they're going to completely ignore the data. They're going to say it's actually part of the problem, right? So you've got to kind of get them to turn, every audience to turn that emotional part of the brain back on through the dopamine, through the frontal cortex, because the brain wants to do it anyway. You can't override your brain. It's going to do that. All the anger you have, all the fear you have, all the hate you have is only going to work so long because it's an artificial state for your brain to function in. If you pull people back to, let me tell you a story, rather than let me argue politically about your politics, the brain starts to slow down and open up at the same time. So does it have a place in healing? Absolutely. it's going to take time to override everything else that's going on. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally.
Right?
Totally makes
You're
sense.
bombarded 24/7 by CNN and Fox. And what do you do with that? Right? Your poor brain is just overheating.
Yeah. Part of the talk that I gave yesterday, we get like 10,000 messages a day, and there's researchers said we're not information handlers anymore, we're information avoiders, because we get so much information. And it reminded me of something else too. I know there was a study done with people who were of opposing views. They found out that they could never bring them together with their positions, but they could bring them together with their interests. And social learning theory talks about how if we use common symbols and signs and emotions, that can help us kind of merge with the audience. And so telling stories that evoke emotion, like you're talking about, I think could really, help to move people closer together, because they have commonalities, and it focuses on that and the emotions involved rather than their differences of position.
Exactly. When I was teaching, I was an English teacher teaching science students. I never came in and talked poetry with them. I came in and talked science with them, right? And tried to explain to them that science is a story. So's poetry, so's math, so's physics. There are stories underlying all of it. So let me share my story of my math experience with you, so that then you can share your story of the math experience with me. But it might be a different story, but we found that common element, which is, let me tell you a story about me and math, or let me tell you a story about me in the stock market for the business students. They immediately opened up, because this guy isn't telling me the story I expected, which is, let me tell you a story about this poem. I want to talk about what you want to talk about, man. And let me share a story with you. And I think that's where it has a real role in healing. I'm trying to do that now. We're into an election cycle up here, and I'm working with a couple of candidates. And the first impulse is to go on the attack or go into the defensive. And I'm saying, let's just go with the third impulse, which ignore it all, and you start telling your story. And that's a hard sell right now, because it's got so partisan and so divided and so divisive, that getting people to kind of move off one of those positions is the bigger challenge. I think the storytelling I know will work. It's just getting that person to embrace it is the bigger challenge.
Well, I think we could keep talking all afternoon, Clay. I would actually really enjoy that. You've been a fantastic presenter. We so much appreciate you sharing your wisdom and the science and the story of how you got to where you are. And again, the PowerPoints are posted in the Whova app. So if you want to download those, and I think, Clay, you mentioned if people want to talk offline, they can feel free to chat with you and send you messages. Again, thank you very much. I want to put in a plug for our Blue Pencil Gold Screen Award show, which is at 8 o'clock tonight, 5 o'clock here on the West Coast. And we're going to have some fantastic entrants, and you're going to get to see sort of the best of the best in government communications. It's a lively show. I think you'll really enjoy it. So I encourage you to come on out, and otherwise have a great rest of your day.
Thank you very much. Bye all.